Good evening. This is the first day of December of 2021. Pleasant Valley Baptist Church. Wednesday, the pastor. We're glad to have you. We're having a little study of David's life on our midweek service. And we started in Bethlehem, and then we went to Gibeah, and then we went to the Valley of Elah. And tonight we're going to return to the city of Gibeah. Now, if you look on your Bible atlas, you'll find that Gibeah is just north and a little bit east of Jerusalem. It's not in the tribe of Judah. It's in the tribe of Benjamin. And that's where King Saul had set up the first kingdom for Israel because he was of the tribe of Benjamin. And we're going forward. On his first trip to Gibeah, do you remember what he was doing? What did he do when he got there? He'd playing his harp. Remember when Saul was troubled by an evil spirit and David was playing the harp and so forth? And I think it settled Saul's heart, but he didn't take any real particular notice of David. Then we went to Valley of Elah, and we have the story of Goliath. And what happens, things will never be the same for David now. Taking the life of Goliath opens brand new realms for David in his life. David will no longer be a sheep herder. He'll no longer be a shepherd. He'll no longer be doing the pastoral life. He is now becoming a warrior. He'll start off as a warrior for King Saul, and later he'll be a warrior for the nation of Israel, Judah, and of course a warrior for the Lord. You see, when we come to returning to Gibeah after Goliath, David doesn't have a temporary job with King Saul. He is a regular. He is permanent. And he's leaving leaving Judea, leaving Bethlehem, and going into a new country of the Benjaminites. Now, it's not a new country, but it's a new area, a new culture. Just like when you come to Alaska, that's a different culture than if you're coming from Colorado or Philadelphia or California or Oregon or any of these places. And with this new culture, this whole new world for David, he's going to have a new role. He's going to have a new purpose, new destination. And what God is doing is he's putting David in King Saul's court. What you're going through right now in your life, I have found that is merely a training for later on. What you're experiencing right now is going to be kind of important to you, very important, as time goes forward. Now, go with me to the book of 1 Samuel and chapter 17. After David has killed Goliath, and we're in chapter 17, and we'll be going down to verse 55. Excuse me. And when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell. Now, you think with me for a minute here. Has David played his harp for King Saul? Yeah. But Saul has taken no notice of David. He's no particular notice. And he says to Abner, his captain, he said, Who is that? And Abner says, I don't know who he is. And the king said, Inquire thou whose son this stripling is, this young man. And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Now, David hasn't went to Jerusalem with the head yet, because he's going to leave the head of the giant in Jerusalem, Jebus. But isn't it interesting here? Here's this kid carrying around this great big head. It must have been a monstrosity. And Saul said unto him, Whose son art thou, thou young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. He said, I'm Jesse's son. David had sung for him. David had been his peacemaker, the one that had calmed his soul. And now David is a mighty warrior for Saul. And Saul comes to his senses. Now, over in the book of Luke, chapter 4 and verse 24, it says, A prophet is not without honor, save in his own country. And that's kind of the way it was with David. David could play for the king and do all of these things and settle his heart and everything, but nobody took any notice of him. But you know what God was doing? You know why God brought David into the king's palace? Had not God had him anointed to be king of Israel? This was David's training. This is like going to college. This is like going to a trade school. He says, David, I want you to see the mechanics, how all of these things work. Now, some of the people you meet along the way in life, there will be a few people that are going to be very, very instrumental in your life. As I think back over my ministries and so forth, there's been some men that have stood out in my life, that have stood with me and so forth, and I thank God for them. We find in chapter 18, we find one man that does that. And it says, And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan, now Jonathan was Saul's son, was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Isn't it interesting? Right here at the beginning, Jonathan and David become soul brothers. It says he's loved him as his own soul. That word soul could be translated breath. The breath of David and the breath of Solomon, you couldn't distinguish the two. They were both the same. But I want you to remember, Jonathan was a city boy. He was from Gibeah. David was from Bethlehem. So one of them was a city boy, one of them was a country boy, right? They weren't too much alike in that. But there was one thing about them. They were both very, very valiant. Both of them were warriors, bar none. They were brave. One thing I want you to know about Jonathan. Jonathan was never jealous of David. Never. Now, think with me for a minute. Who usually becomes the next king? The king's oldest son, right? And that was Jonathan. Jonathan was being primed to become the next king. And yet, Jonathan sees something in David that he really likes. And when he gets to meet with David, things are going to happen here. David is going to have new relationships. He's going to have new friends. There's only going to be one thing that's going to separate Jonathan and David. You know what that is?
His dad.
Pardon?
His dad.
Is that going to separate them? Death. Death is the only thing that's going to separate Jonathan and David. And then we go on and it says in verse 2, And Saul took him that day and would let him go no more home to his father's house. So David's life has changed, right? It's going to be a regimented life. It's going to be a life of military. It's going to be a life of discipline. Verse 3, then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. Now, what is a covenant?
It's better than a contract. A contract is established on distrust. A covenant is based on trust.
Okay, a contract is based on trust. Under the covenant, the covenant, a person says, I will do, period. I'm going to do this. A contract says, I'll do this if this happens and that don't happen. And you see, with the contract, you're always looking for ways to break the contract and get out of it. So Jonathan makes a covenant with David. I think someone dressed up like that in our fall festival, didn't they? And they're dressed up together. And I want you to understand what Jonathan does here. Verse 4, and Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him. What was that robe? What did that robe signify? He was the prince. He was the next king. Jonathan takes that robe off and puts it on David and gave it to David and his garments, even to his sword and to his bow and to his girdle. You know, David's brother, what did David's brothers think of David? Just before Goliath, what did his oldest brother say?
We know the naughtiness of thy heart. You've just come to see the war.
That's his brothers. Now, is that the spirit of Jonathan? Exactly opposite. I think a change comes, and I think because of what Jonathan is doing here. Go with me to chapter 22 and verse 1. David is running from Saul. David there departed thence and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. So I see that David eventually wins his brothers, but it wasn't until after the king's son, the prince, Jonathan, showed his tremendous love and compassion. What is happening to David's life? Is it not expanding now? Isn't things broadening out in his life? He's no longer a shepherd. He's now a warrior. He's now in the army. He's now part of the chief of staff. Not only is he getting new allies, I'll put them this way, equipped with new allies. Now I want you to notice what Jonathan is doing here. David is being equipped with new tools. Notice it says here in verse 4 that he gave him his sword and his bow and to his girdle. He has now, instead of a slingshot and a staff, he now has a sword, he has a bow, he has arrows, he has a spear, he has a shield, many new tools to work with, many new people to work with. And David has been given people that stand with him. As you go through life, you're going to find there's some people that say they're your friend, and there's some people that show you they're friends.
That's right.
Go with me to 2 Samuel chapter 22. 2 Samuel 22. In 2 Samuel 22 and verse number 16. No, 23, 23:16. In verse 15, 23, verse 15. And David longed and said, "Oh, that one would give me a drink of water of the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate." Well, we know where that well is today. There are just not that many wells in Bethlehem. And David says, "Man, I'd give anything for a cup of water from Bethlehem." Well, verse 16. And the three mighty men of David brake through the host of the Philistines and drew water out of the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. Nevertheless, he would not drink thereof, but he poured it out unto the Lord. Why didn't he drink that water?
He didn't feel worthy.
Hey, these men risked their life to give David a drink of water. Do you understand what this meant to David? This meant to David, these men's devotion to David was stronger than the desire for them to keep living. These men loved David, their commander, so much that David said, I just long for a drink of water. And they bring the water to David, and David pours it out. In other words, David gives back to the Lord and said, "Thank you for these men. Thank you for this support. Thank you for these that are standing with me. I know now that we're going to win the battle." You see, God has given you people in your life that's going to be the strength that you need as you face these battles. Go with me to chapter 21 and verse 16. But Ashbi-bonob, wouldn't you like to have that kind of a name? Which was of the sons of the giant, sons of Goliath, the weight of whose spear weighed 300 shekels of brass in weight, he being girded with a new sword, thought to have slain David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, succored him, and smote the Philistine, and killed him. Now, this man that killed this giant happens to be one of David's brother's kids. So that makes Abishai his nephew. Abishai's nephew saves David's life. David's getting to be an old man, and he's just not as quick as he used to be. And David's brother's son, Abishai, comes in and smote the Philistine, killed him. Then the men of David sware unto him, saying, "Thou shalt not go no more out with us to battle, that thou quench not the light of Israel." He said, "You're getting too old, David. You're not going to go to battle anymore. We want you around a little while. We'll take care of the heavy stuff." Now, does that show you that the God was making preparations for David? It shows me here that God was going to take care of him. God's going to take care of you. Whatever situation he puts you in there, he's going to give you the people you need. Now, two things that Jonathan gave David. One, he gave him bow and arrows. Was that for up close contact, or was that for long distance?
Long range.
Long range, right? The arrow goes out there and get us. And the sword, what was the sword for?
Close.
Right up close, right? Get right in there. You know, today we have so many guided missiles, and we have guided drones and so forth today. You remember back in World War I, these men were eyeball to eyeball. They could see each other's eyes. And they were shooting at one another and fighting one another. But today we're getting further and further and further away. But you see, Jonathan was preparing David for the battle that was ahead. There was going to be some things long range, and there was going to be some things right up close. I can make an application here, can't I? The long range is taken care of by prayer. You know, we can't go to Missouri, we can't go to Oregon, we can't go to, we're right here in Alaska, but our prayers can go straight, can it? I mean, we can go right to God and say, God, I have a concern that's going on down there. What can you do? So I see that the bow and arrow is a picture of praying. Now, what is for right up close? Well, I call it the Bible. The Bible is called the sword, the Word of God, right? And that takes care of your problems right when you're in the trenches, right when the devil's there fighting you and bringing hard things to you. I'd like for you to go with me to 1 Samuel now, chapter 20. I'm still talking about Jonathan. And David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is mine iniquity? And what is my sin before thy father, that he seeketh my life?" And he said unto him, "God forbid, thou shalt not die. Behold, my father," so this is Jonathan speaking, "will do nothing either great or small, but that he will show it me. And why should my father hide anything from me? It is not so." And David sware moreover and said, "Thy father certainly knoweth that I have found grace in thine eyes." And he saith, "Let not Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, there is but a step between me and death." And Jonathan said unto David, "Whatsoever thy soul desireth, I will even do it for thee." So David said, I want you to find out your dad's heart. So, to cut a long story short, verse 41. They went out and shot an arrow, and Jonathan said, "If the arrow is beyond thee, son," his servant, he's actually telling David that my dad's after you. In verse 41, "And as soon as the lad was gone, David arose out of a place toward the south, and fell on his face to the ground, and bowed himself 3 times. And they kissed one another, and wept one another, until David exceeded." In other words, David got his composure back. They knew that there's going to be separated now, because Saul was after David's life, and he's going to kill him. And they wept, and finally David got control of himself. In verse 42, "And Jonathan said to David, Go in peace, for as much as we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, The Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever. And he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city." Folks, true love and true friendship does not have to have constant, personal, intimate, or close relationship. David will maybe one more time speak to Jonathan, but they will be friends till death. And after death, David makes a special dispensation for one of Jonathan's children, Mephibosheth. And David takes care of Mephibosheth. He's handicapped, and takes care of him and feeds him his whole life. Now you see, David and Jonathan's relationship was a true one. It wasn't just, oh, we're going to be friends. then something comes up and divides them. But go with me to chapter 31, 1 Samuel. In chapter 31, and now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Melchizedek, Saul's son. Tragic. I would have never written God's word this way, but I'm not God. I would have saved Samuel. I would have saved Jonathan. But that's not God's way. Jonathan was faithful till the death. I'm sure that we're going to see Jonathan in heaven. Jonathan had the right spirit. Jonathan was giving his kingship to David. He had humbled himself to the Lord's anointed, and the Lord was taking care of him. Now, some other things were happening in David's life. Go with me back to chapter 18. Not only has David got new equipment to learn to deal with, not only does he have new allies he has to deal with, he's got a new outlook on life. In chapter 18, verse 15, wherefore, when Saul saw that he, David, behaved himself very wisely, Saul was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, because he went out and came in before them. He was ambitious. He did the work that was out there for him. He was a very brave man. And Saul said to David, behold, my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battle. For Saul said, let not my hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. Now, just a minute. What was the deal killing Goliath?
He was supposed to get the king's daughter.
He was supposed to get the king's daughter.
And his dad would be tax-free.
And his dad would be tax-free. And David kills Goliath, and guess what? I don't know if Jesse had to pay taxes or not, but here he is, a couple chapters later, and David's not married yet. Finally, he says, I'll give you my oldest daughter here, but you got to bring me a bounty. And David said unto Saul, who am I? And what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? But it came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given unto Adriel, the Mohalathite, to wife. Now that seems like he's been stiff, doesn't it? You know, sometimes you're going to miss out on some things you think you really should have. You know, I'm a junker. And when I was getting ready to pastor in Penrose, there was some men that I had bought a modular home from, and they was cleaning up a construction yard, and I bid on cleaning up the construction yard. There were several semi-loads of lumber and a bunch of glass and windows and just all kinds of stuff. And so I placed a bid, and somebody else beat me out. So I was walking through that construction yard, and I said, Lord, why do you always give me just the junk? Why don't I never get anything good? And I was feeling really sorry for myself. And I was just looking around. And pretty soon the owners came out of the pay building and said, you know, this guy's shady that we give the contract to. We'll accept your bid. in an instant, what I thought would have been a blessing, now I had to pay for it. Now I had to do something with that wood. Now I had to do something. And the Lord worked it out. I went to my my uncles that I was working for and said, I bought 2 or 3 semi-loads of lumber and so forth. I need to pay for some of this. So they went down, looked at it, and they bought the good stuff. And guess what I was wound up with? The junk. And God taught me a few things. What looked like it was a disaster for David here is he's going to get a good wife. Maybe you'd say second best. No, I think it's best. It says in verse 20, and Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give him her, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistine may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in the one of the twain. And Saul commanded his servants, saying, commune with David secretly, and say, behold, the king hath delight in thee, and all the servants love thee. Now therefore be the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spoke those words in the ears of David. And David said, seemeth to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, on this matter spake David. And Saul said, thus shalt thou say to David, the king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. He said, if David can kill 100 Philistine men, he's going to get killed himself. Sound like a deal, huh? But did you notice what David said? He said, is it a light thing to you that I'm marrying the king's daughter? Verse 27, wherefore David arose, went, he and his men, and slew the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, to wife. He didn't back out on it. He asked for 100 dead Philistines. David gave him 200. So he gave him Michal. Well, that's not the end of the story, you see. There's going to be a new purpose put into David's life. King Saul is perceiving David as a threat to his kingdom. And you know what he's going to do? Well, he gets Michal. Let me tell you something. You're best with the people that love you. You're best with your family that loves you. It's not a pedigree. It's not from a higher class or a different class or more money. But I want you to notice one thing it says here, that Michal loved David. Now, is that going to make a difference? Well, it's going to be it's going to be a real problem here. I want you to go back. I'll pick this story up later, but I want you to go back to chapter 18. A song that changed David's life. Can you think of a song that changed your life? Well, this one's going to change his life. It says in verse 5 of chapter 18, and David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely, and Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And it came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the city of Israel, singing and dancing to meet Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed but thousands, and what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. Isn't it interesting? Who killed Goliath? Was it Saul? It's David. Now, why were the people exalting David? Because they saw somebody there that said, Is there not a cause? Is not he defying our God of Israel? A spiritual problem here? And he addressed it that way. So, what's happening? God is preparing David in a very strange and new way that is going to change David's life. We don't have any hard record that David sings again until he gets the ark and he brings it back to Jerusalem. And that's a long ways down the road. Excuse me. You see what happens in chapter 18. We go down to verse 10. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house, and David played with his hand as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. Saul said, I'm going to nail him to the wall. I'm going to kill him. Twice. But he never got the job done. David avoided him both times. Go with me to chapter 19 and verse 10. And Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin. Here's number 3. But he slipped away out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Go with me to chapter 20 and verse 33. Verse 32. And Jonathan answered Saul his dad, his father, and said unto him, Wherefore doth he be slain? What hath he done? And Saul cast a javelin at him, Jonathan, to smite him, whereby Jonathan knew that it was determined that his father to slay David. Jonathan knew that his dad was out to kill his friend. Where can David put his trust? You can only put your trust in the Lord. You see, Gibeon at the first time was a place to learn and to be exalted. But this time it was a place to learn to trust God. He was getting new tools, he was getting a new outlook, he was getting a new purpose, he was getting all of these new friends. But he had a problem. The king wanted to kill him. Now, I've got him in the city of Gibeon. How am I going to get him out? Well, go with me to chapter 19 and verse number 11. And Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, If thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. Now his wife says, my dad's going to kill you tomorrow. He's got the army out there. He's going to kill you. Now, did God put Michal into David's life? Yes. Look at verse 12. Sounds almost like Paul. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. He had came into Jerusalem as a mighty, valiant soldier, having had the victory over Goliath, and now he's leaving Gibeah at night, running for his life. A night escape. Folks, there's going to be some of these in your life. There's going to be some night experiences when you have to say, Lord, here's my life. Tonight, you do with it as you please. And you know, that's really a disconcerting time. It just crushes you. Go with me to Psalm 34. I don't know if David wrote this now or some other time, but but in Psalm 34 and verse 22. Verse 19. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth him out of them all. He keepeth all his bones. Not one of them is broken. That's a prophecy of Christ dying on Calvary's cross. Remember, they came to break his leg bones so he'd die quicker. He's already dead. Evil shall slay the wicked, and they that hate the righteous shall be desolate. Here's the verse. The Lord redeemeth the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. When you escape by the skin of your teeth, you know it's of the Lord. You know the Lord brought you through the trial, and he delivered you, and not man. So the city of Gibeah was a place where David was having to retool, where David was having to reassess, where David was having to re-equip himself for the ministry that laid ahead of him. The first time he came, it was a great time. This time he came, it was a real education. It was a time of a lot of heartache. So I trust this has been a blessing to you.